After World War II, the United States military assumed an unprecedented global presence. For many young men, especially from small rural towns who were detached from higher education or business opportunities, military service provided a chance for success. One of those was Charles Robert Jenkins. He lived in Rich Square, North Carolina. He had lots of childhood nicknames, but mainly he was known as Robert. He was born into a large but poor family in 1940. Robert was just a boy when his father died, and as a teenager, he freely admits he was a bit of a troublemaker. He was a bad student. He dropped out of school in 7th grade, and he started smoking cigarettes when he was only 14. But along the way, he noticed soldiers who were stationed at a military base near his town. They were always cool and confident, and he noticed they were always surrounded by pretty girls. So in 1955, Robert walked into a National Guard recruitment office. He had convinced his mother to sign a note saying that he was old enough to join, which was a lie. But the note was accepted, no questions asked. And with that, Robert began a 3-year term in the North Carolina National Guard. He was just 15 years old. The National Guard provided a sense of accomplishment that he never felt in school. After 3 years in the Guard, Jenkins immediately enlisted in the U.S. Army. His first overseas assignment was to South Korea. Within a year, he was promoted to sergeant and transferred to Germany. And his 3 years in Germany were some of the best years of his life. Then, in 1964, Jenkins was transferred back to South Korea. This time to a small base called Camp Clinch, situated right along the border with North Korea. At Camp Clinch, soldiers made daily patrols of the border. Among the soldiers, these patrols were commonly referred to as hunter-killer teams. Jenkins found the patrols dangerous. He thought they were more provocative than defensive, and on one occasion the North Koreans actually shot at him. Concurrently, military action and U.S. involvement in Vietnam was escalating, and rumors were circulating that his division was going to be sent to go fight in Vietnam. So Jenkins hated Camp Clinch. He hated the patrols. He was having trouble overcoming the fear that being shot at had caused him, and now, on top of all that, he also feared that any day he was going to be deployed to go fight in Vietnam, which in his mind was a certain death sentence. In his own words, "I was becoming overwhelmed by a fear of impending death." Jenkins became consumed by anxiety and depression, and he started drinking way too much. Even if his fears were irrational for him, at that time, they were real and they were intense. He convinced himself he had to get out or he wouldn't survive, and he started planning his desertion. Jenkins knew abandoning his assignment and forsaking his fellow soldiers was dishonorable and illegal. He fully expected to be arrested and to face a military tribunal. If he tried to go absent without leave in South Korea, he knew what would happen. He'd quickly be found, he'd be arrested, and he'd be returned to Camp Clinch. In fact, there was a military prison on the grounds of the base for just such cases. More than anything, he wanted to get out of Camp Clinch. As he understood it, communists were the enemy, and communists were all the same. They were all controlled by Moscow. Jenkins knew several soldiers who deserted into East Germany. They were quickly captured, taken as prisoners by the Soviets, and eventually returned to the United States in routine prisoner exchanges. He thought he'd be treated similarly if he deserted into North Korea. He was not a defector. He was not a communist sympathizer. He truly believed this would be the easiest course to get back to the United States. Clearly, Robert didn't understand how isolated and perilous North Korea was. Robert would later admit in his own words, "I was scared, disillusioned, and ignorant." Between 1964 and 1973, there were over 500,000 U.S. military desertions. But Of those, over 500,000, only 6 deserted by voluntarily walking into North Korea. Only 6 total out of over 500,000. And on the freezing cold night of January 4th, 1965, Robert Jenkins became one of those 6. Before reporting for his scheduled patrol that night, he drank 10 beers, he said, to calm his nerves. He reported for duty as usual. Nobody noticed that he was drunk. After a couple of hours, he separated from the other soldiers. He then unloaded his gun and tied a t-shirt around its muzzle. He didn't want the North Koreans to think that he was entering looking for a fight. He then simply used his compass and walked to the north. The sun hadn't quite risen yet when he saw the first North Korean soldier. The moment he saw the soldier, he knew that North Korean soldier had seen him as well. Jenkins described the moment as being strangely quiet. There was no alarm sounded or even any shouting, but somehow, nonetheless, only seconds later, about 10 more North Korean soldiers were sprinting toward him. There was a fence between Jenkins and these approaching soldiers, and they all piled up on the other side of a gate in the fence. Jenkins could only hope that they weren't going to just simply shoot him right then and there. His fear was eased a bit, though, as he watched the North Koreans. It became apparent that in their haste to reach him, they'd forgotten the key that they needed to open the locked gate. Jenkins remained motionless while one of the North Korean guards ran back into a small hut near their post, got the key, and finally returned to unlock the gate. Once through that gate, they grabbed Jenkins' gun first, and then they encircled him. Nearly a dozen rifles were fixed on him in every direction, which Jenkins was relieved by. He knew once they encircled him, they weren't going to shoot him, or they'd have been shooting each other as well. They carried him into a small one-room building. He was tied to a chair and blindfolded, and that's how Jenkins remained for his entire first day in North Korea. That night and into the next day, the North Koreans attempted to interrogate him, which was almost comically fruitless. The interpreters could barely speak English. Jenkins sensed that they had never attempted an interrogation before, and more than anything, they were genuinely confused as to why this American soldier would just walk into their country. They didn't beat him or torture him or even raise their voices at him. They even provided him a bit of rice and fish as they tried to make sense of him. Just after the sun set on his second day in North Korea, a new group of North Korean soldiers came for Jenkins. They escorted him away, and eventually they put him on a train. Just after the train started moving, Robert Jenkins fell asleep. It was his first sleep in over 48 hours. And he had absolutely no idea where this train was taking him. The Korean peninsula is geographically separated from the rest of Asia. It's surrounded by water to the south, east, and west, and by mountains to the north. Thus, for thousands of years, the Korean people have remained distinctly Korean. That is, until 1910, when imperialist Japan invaded and occupied the Korean peninsula. Japan's surrender ending World War II, however, quashed their Asian empire and represented liberation for Korea. Of course, the victorious Allied powers believed in diametrically conflicting definitions for what liberation meant. The United States and Western Europeans favored republicanism and something close to free markets, while the Soviet Union sought their sordid brand of single-party despotic communism. None of them, however, they agreed were inclined toward further fighting. So instead, they settled for compromise, which left various formerly Axis-controlled territories with new, precarious, arbitrary divisions. Germany was divided into East and West, Vietnam into North and South, and Korea was likewise liberated into North Korea and South Korea. The peninsula was essentially divided in half at 38 degrees north latitude, also called the 38th parallel. Republican, constitutional government formed in the south, while the Soviet Union supported a Stalinesque ideologue named Kim Il-sung in the north. The compromises were made to avoid further immediate discord, but they made future conflict inevitable. Under dictator Kim Il-sung, reunification of Korea became a national objective. The North Korean army declared war on and invaded the South in 1950 in pursuit of this goal. Soviets and Americans each supported their half of Korea. Fighting was intense for 3 years, and the war never actually ended. A state of war between North and South Korea persists today. But the fighting ended with an indefinite, uneasy armistice agreement in 1953. The border remained along the 38th parallel, with a strip of neutral territory between them called the Demilitarized Zone, or for short, the DMZ. Both sides of the DMZ are still heavily guarded, including a constant American presence in the South. And the Soviet-backed founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, then began systematically controlling and indoctrinating his own people. The country has now outlived the Soviet Union, and it's created the only successful dynastic communist government in human history. That is, power is transferred through the Kim family. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, leadership was assumed by his son, Kim Jong-il. And when Kim Jong-il died in 2011, his son, Kim Jong-un, ascended. North Koreans are taught to perceive the Kim family as gods and the United States as murderous imperialist villains. And the North Korean people are now the most isolated people on Earth. The Kim family's control is propagated by an egomaniacal cult of personality. They're known to their people by names like Dear Leader and Eternal General. They regulate all aspects of life through deceit, a hierarchical structure of reward and punishment, and constant threats of death or forced labor. The result for most North Koreans has been physical and psychological devastation. The philosophical foundation of North Korean ideology is self-reliance and unification, which has logically based merit. But in the perpetual human struggle to pursue good over evil, when centralized government claims itself as the standard of goodness, it's assuredly evil. To Robert Jenkins in 1964, however, all of the history and geopolitical circumstances might as well have been written in Korean. He just wanted to get out of Camp Clinch. He didn't know that crossing the DMZ was like crossing the event horizon to a North Korean black hole. That train Robert Jenkins was on took him to North Korea's capital city, Pyongyang. For the next 12 days, he lived in a small, square room containing only a toilet and light bulb. He slept on the floor, and the light was always on. Here, each day he was interrogated for 9 hours. He answered almost every question truthfully with, "I don't know." Realizing that their questions were fruitless, they then transported him to a small house just outside of Pyongyang in a village called Saedong. Entering the house, Jenkins couldn't believe his eyes. Here, he was acquainted with 3 other American soldiers. Of the over 500,000 U.S. military deserters during this period, 6 deserted by walking into North Korea, and now 4 of those 6 were here together in this house. North Korea would later claim the other 2 died shortly after they entered the country, which may or may not be true. The others that Jenkins met were Larry Abshir, James Dresnock, and Jerry Parrish. They were a comfort to Jenkins. He no longer felt so completely alone. In the beginning, it seemed North Korea still didn't quite know what to do with these Americans and likely decided it would be easier to manage them if they remained together. And so they stayed in this tiny house in Saedong for a few months. Here they all slept in one single bedroom. It was freezing cold and the house had no running water. A government officer, which they called their leader, lived with them. Jenkins referred to party officials that provided the constant supervision as the organization. In North Korea, the organization, that is, the government or the party or the bureaucracy, is structured hierarchically. Each small cluster of houses is supervised by an appointed leader, and then each small cluster of leaders is supervised by an appointed cadre. At first, the organization focused on indoctrination, directing the Americans to learn the manners and customs of life in North Korea. Jenkins recalled constant criticism and correction. They were taught protocol and forced to read the nation's history. Even the books written in English were curiously biased. Upon completing a book, they then had to present book reports to the leaders. There were weekly self-criticism sessions. For Jenkins, they were Monday mornings. During the sessions, while standing at attention, he'd confess all the ways he'd failed to meet Kim Il-sung's expectations in the previous week. Jenkins recalled once being harshly reprimanded for confessing, not to leaving the house without permission, but for wanting to leave without permission. Sessions ended with the appointed leader reminding the men that they were failures. The men then recognized that this was true and would deliver a written apology. Then they'd recite some Kim Il-sung tenet. The tenet most commonly recited was, "Our great leader Kim Il-sung taught as follows. The first and foremost task of a revolutionary is to study. If the revolutionary fails to study properly, he will fail to successfully create the revolution." The self-criticism sessions weren't instituted particularly for the Americans. It was the common practice for all North Koreans and simply applied to the Americans as well. For the Americans, most of it was comical. The leaders were often swapped and shuffled. Some took the role seriously while others were disinterested. And the Americans quickly learned that bribes invariably encouraged leniency. Mostly, North Korea still seemed to be confused by the Americans. For the first few years, they weren't directed to do any real work, and they were arbitrarily moved every few months. For Jenkins, maybe the greatest difficulty was living a life that lacked purpose. For him, it was a life without meaning and without a future. By 1971, Robert Jenkins had been in North Korea for 6 years. And that's when a North Korean official visited the Americans professing he had good news. The leader explained that Kim Il-sung wanted to offer them all citizenship in North Korea. Of course, it wasn't exactly a genuine offer. One cadre made it clear that the alternative was most likely a labor camp assignment. Citizenship made sense from the organization's perspective. These were Americans who deliberately left the U.S. Army and entered their North Korean promised land. They could be useful for propaganda inside and outside of North Korea. Jenkins never expected or wanted to be a citizen of North Korea, but he was starting to feel more compelled to capitulate for his own good. To have any semblance of a normal life in North Korea, he might have to play by their rules. The organization made some assurances with citizenship. Most appealing to Jenkins was the potential privilege he'd receive to become a sort of head of household. All North Korean men are afforded this opportunity, which includes being assigned a house and the possibility for marriage. If Jenkins was being forced to accept a lifetime in North Korea, at least citizenship might also provide a chance to have a family and the more meaningful life he yearned for. So all 4 Americans studied and passed exams and became legal citizens in 1972. Jenkins' ID booklet, which all citizens have, listed his occupation as office worker with the Peaceful Unification Committee. Jenkins laughed. He'd never heard of this committee before. Jenkins and the others did receive the promised houses, and a ration box was delivered each month, which was stamped on the side, a gift from Kim Il Sung. The boxes generally contained toothpaste, soap, detergent, socks, 2 bottles of beer, and 40 packs of cigarettes. Almost everyone in North Korea smokes cigarettes. After all, anyone who's addicted to something is more likely to follow the leader if the leader is supplying that thing that they're addicted to. Jenkins was assigned his first real job in 1974. It was to be an English teacher at the local college. He thought amused that only in North Korea would he, a 7th grade dropout, be assigned the role of college professor. Jenkins soon realized, though, his hopes for marriage would be short-lived. In North Korea, it's strictly forbidden for any Korean to marry a non-Korean. So instead, the organization started a new program for the Americans and assigned what Jenkins called cooks to live with them. Jenkins' use of the term cook was likely for lack of a better term. It seems that in rural North Carolina, there is no word for a government-assigned live-in stranger pseudo-wife. They all lived under these arrangements for the next 6 to 8 years. Later, they discovered the cooks were only assigned to the Americans' houses after the government became convinced that the women were infertile. North Koreans ostracize infertility. A society in perpetual revolution is always in need of future revolutionaries. A woman unable to provide for the future loses much of her value to the collective. So, for the organization, the women could fulfill a promise they'd made to their newest citizens without compromising the purity of their precious Korean bloodlines. Or so they thought. In 1978, all of the women were removed and the entire practice was ended for good when Larry Abshir's cook became pregnant. None of the cooks or the child was ever seen or heard from again. Overall, for Jenkins, citizenship provided some solace. It was a chance for a more normal life, which he wanted. But he also sadly recognized, though, that any intrinsic acceptance of the benefits of citizenship also symbolized his resignation. He was essentially setting up a new home and life. He was settling in. He realized that he was no longer hopeful that one day he would leave North Korea. Now, he was just hopeful that he could pursue normality where he was. Robert Jenkins' family back in North Carolina didn't know where he was or if he was even still alive. They only had one clue that he'd deserted into North Korea. Shortly after he went missing, Robert's mother received a strange telegram. It was purportedly from Robert himself, telling her that he had chosen to leave the army and decided to go live in North Korea. Curiously, though, the telegram was signed with the name Charles. While Charles is, in fact, Robert Jenkins' given first name, he was never called and never went by the name Charles. For this reason, the family didn't believe he sent this note to his mother. Many years later, Robert confirmed that the note did not come from him. To this day, that telegram remains a mystery. For nearly 40 years to the Jenkins family, it was as if Robert had simply vanished. Robert Jenkins witnessed several events that almost instigated renewed war between the United States and North Korea from an almost unique perspective. In both cases, Jenkins reported that normal life in North Korea changed for everyone living there for years after each event. The first was in January 1968, when North Korea captured a U.S. ship called the Pueblo. The second was in August 1976, when a neighborly dispute over a tree in a Korean village called Panmunjom turned deadly. Both incidents sent North Korea into what Jenkins called total war preparation mode, and he saw firsthand the fervor and hatred they hold for the United States. The USS Pueblo was a naval research and spy ship. It was not a warship or battleship. The United States maintains that the ship never entered North Korean waters, although North Korea disagreed and fired on the ship. One American sailor, Dwayne Hodges, was killed in the attack. The Pueblo wasn't prepared for battle or defense and was forced to surrender. Its crew of 82 men was captured. They were beaten and they were held hostage in North Korea for 11 months. Revenge, even war, was demanded by some in the United States. One congressman even suggested a nuclear attack. Eventually, though, after negotiations, all 82 Americans were freed. Although the USS Pueblo remains in North Korea's possession today. Presently, it's the only commissioned U.S. ship held in an enemy's hands. In North Korea, the Pueblo is on display as part of the country's Victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum collection as a relic of their strength and nationalism. It was the closest the two countries had come to war since the 1953 armistice. That is, until that 1976 dispute over a tree growing near the DMZ in Panmunjom. North Koreans believed that tree was planted by their nation's founder, Kim Il-sung. The US and South Korea just thought it was blocking their view of military stations in the north. So when US and South Korean troops approached the tree to trim its branches, North Korean troops approached to defend it, and they killed 2 Americans with their own axes. Many on both sides called for further military action, and both strengthened forces along the border. 2 days later, the U.S. did send 800 troops and 20 helicopters to Panmunjom to cover 16 soldiers with chainsaws. They cut the tree down completely. The tension eventually cooled, and war was avoided. In North Korea, Jenkins recalled that following each of these incidents for years, propaganda campaigns intensified and became more aggressive. Food, supplies, and electricity became scarce. After Panmunjom, North Korean schools closed for an entire year, and all students instead went into military training. For Jenkins, total war prep mode wasn't all bad. He did become a scapegoat for North Koreans who needed a target for their hatred. He was often the only American within their sights. But at the same time, the organization's focus on war prep meant they were less focused on monitoring his daily life. Jenkins later learned and was surprised that in the United States, school children rarely learn about these events in history classes. Most American history students have never heard of the Pueblo or of Panmunjom, while in North Korea, still today, the events are widely remembered and celebrated as legendary. It would be rare to find a North Korean student who did not know all about the Pueblo or Panmunjom. In fact, in the years following the capture of the USS Pueblo, a popular feature film was produced. All media in North Korea is controlled by the state and exclusively focused on propaganda. And for this movie, and for other movies, the organization needed men who could portray the bad guys. That's how Robert Jenkins and the other Americans became North Korean movie stars. The organization had finally devised a pragmatic use for the Americans. They needed actors and models to play the villains for poster campaigns and in movies. So all 4, Dresnok, Abshir, Parrish, and Robert Jenkins, received several assignments from the propaganda department. All movies, television, and print media are controlled by the state in North Korea, and it's all designed to propagate the party's motives and ideals. Even though the Americans played the roles of the ugly American, they became sort of celebrities. There must be some predisposition in human DNA to find the silver screen alluring. They were often recognized by strangers and even asked to sign autographs. The propaganda department is revered in North Korea. Usually, only the brightest, best connected, most loyal citizens receive assignments. Jenkins acted in one film that was directed by a young Kim Jong-il before he ascended to great leader. Although, even to a poor kid from North Carolina, the movies were comically bad compared to Hollywood. The effects were cartoonish, and they never had the right props or costumes. So, as the 1980s approached, Jenkins had become a citizen of North Korea. He was a well-known actor, had worked as a college English teacher, and lived in his own home. He lived better than the average Korean and had sort of settled into a normal routine life, but knew chances were slim that he'd ever have a normal family. However, maybe surprisingly, the organization didn't forget that the Americans were still single. Shortly after the assigned live-in cooks were dismissed from the men's homes, party officials visited them again. This time, they brought 4 women with them, and these women were not Korean. They were from Lebanon and presented as wives for the Americans. Robert Jenkins convinced the leaders he did not want an assigned wife. The other 3 accepted, though, and were almost immediately married. None of them knew at the time that these women had been kidnapped by North Korean agents working abroad. They all later learned that these women were captured in a ruse. The women were told they could have jobs and money if they agreed to travel to Japan. The agents targeted vulnerable women who were addicted to drugs or working as prostitutes. The women didn't know they'd actually be traveling to North Korea and offered as wives to several former American soldiers. Within months, though, the kidnappings were discovered by their families back in Lebanon. And having been outed, officials took the women back and sent them home. But one of the women, named Siham Shreta, Jerry Parish's wife, was pregnant. Her family in Lebanon was devoutly religious. Siham's parents insisted she must then stay with Parish in North Korea. For Siham, it seems that freedom eluded her no matter where she was. Parish and Siham, though, did remain married and lived together in North Korea for the rest of their lives. The other 3 Lebanese women were never seen or heard from again. After a few more months, though, the organization assigned the Americans new wives. Jenkins maintained he did not want an assigned wife, and the organization did not force him to marry. Dresnok and Abshir again accepted. Dresnok's wife, Dona, was Romanian, and Abshir's, Anocha, was from Thailand. Again, the Americans didn't know for sure at the time that these women had also been kidnapped. They did suspect it was possible, and they rationalized their participation. Nobody in North Korea has the means to expose the state's crimes to the outside world, and any attempt would likely lead to a much worse situation for both of them. So the Americans felt the best way they could help these poor women from inside North Korea was to take them into their homes and offer support and protection as their husbands. Soon enough, it was confirmed. Dona was captured in a ruse similar to the one used in Lebanon, and Anocha was simply attacked in an alleyway and taken by force. Robert Jenkins avoided dealing with the moral conflict that these marriages must have presented for the others. He just firmly refused to participate. Although, Jenkins didn't remain alone for long. Robert's life changed forever when on June 30th, 1980, at 10 p.m., there was a knock on his door, and in his own words, When I opened the door, my heart stopped. She was introduced as a young Korean woman named Min. She needed to learn English. Jenkins would be her teacher. It wasn't a choice. She arrived reluctantly. She was obviously scared. Robert understood. In North Korea, anytime people meet, it's under an air of suspicion. This assignment was different. She wasn't there to be his wife or to be his cook. She was there to be his student. They slept in separate rooms and they barely spoke to each other for the first few weeks. Slowly, though, she warmed up to him and realized he wasn't going to harm her. They first started bonding, talking more over late-night card games and smoking cigarettes together. Once she opened up a bit, Robert learned her name wasn't Min. She wasn't even Korean, as he'd been told. She was actually from Japan. Her name was Hitomi Soga. Robert wondered how she ended up in North Korea. Maybe she was from a family of communist sympathizers and came to North Korea to study. Or maybe she was kidnapped, like the foreigners who'd married the other Americans. He'd heard rumors that North Korean kidnappings were happening in Japan. Over time, Robert gained more of Hitomi's trust. And eventually, she told him exactly how she ended up in North Korea and how she ended up at his house. It was the night of August 12th, 1978. Hitomi was 19 years old. She lived with her parents and younger sister on Sado Island off the west coast of Japan's mainland. She, at the time, was studying to be a nurse. That night, she and her mother went for ice cream together. As they walked home, 3 men jumped out at them. She was grabbed, tied up, gagged, and forced into a large black bag. They carried her in the bag to a boat, which sped away. She wasn't let out of the bag until the next day, and by the time she could see at all she could see was sea. On the second night, the boat approached a port city that she could only recognize as foreign. Only later did she learn she'd been taken to Chongjin, North Korea. Hitomi's mother, Miyoshi Soga, was never seen or heard by anyone ever again. Robert was devastated for Hitomi, but he also felt kind of proud to know that she trusted him with her story. And he promised her he'd do whatever he could to help her and to protect her. When the two of them met, Robert was 40. Hitomi was 21. They spoke different languages. They had little in common beyond smoking cigarettes. Under any other circumstances, affection would have been unlikely at best. But with circumstances as they were, Robert and Hitomi had 2 more very powerful things in common. They were both alone, and they both hated North Korea. Robert knew they had developed at least some connection. Robert liked the idea of having a family, but not the idea of having a wife assigned to him. And for Hitomi, she'd finally found someone with some compassion who she could trust. About 4 months after she arrived at his house, Robert asked Hitomi to marry him. She said yes. When Robert told the cadres they both wanted to get married, the cadres were shocked, but actually happy for him, and helped him arrange the details. Robert Jenkins and Hitomi Soga were married on August 8th, 1980. Only once while in North Korea did Robert say that he was so happy he forgot he was there. It was 1 month after he married Hitomi, when he found out she was pregnant. Unfortunately, just after, he was called for a new months-long movie assignment. While Robert was away, the pregnancy didn't go well for Hitomi. She had complications throughout, and at 7 months was admitted to the hospital where she went into labor. She delivered a tiny baby boy 2 months premature. He was only 10 inches long and weighed only 2 pounds. Robert returned just after and immediately went to see Hitomi and his newborn son at the hospital. The baby was incubated. The doctor told Robert the plan was to wait and hope. North Korean hospitals don't allow overnight visitors, so Robert spent that night alone at home. When he returned the next morning to the hospital, a cadre was waiting to talk to him. The cadre told Robert his son was dead. The boy's entire life on Earth lasted only 23 hours. The cadre told Robert the organization would take care of the baby's body. Hitomi stayed in the hospital 10 more days to recover physically, but remained psychologically devastated indefinitely. Robert seemed unable to convince her that their son's death was not her fault. For Robert and Hitomi, the sadness remained forever, but it was alleviated some when 2 years later, in 1983, their first daughter, named Mika, was born. And a bit more even when 2 years after that, in 1985, the family became complete with the addition of another girl named Brenda. Both Mika and Brenda were born happy and healthy, without complications, and purely innocent, oblivious of their troubled location. In 1984, the organization decided to move the 4 American families into a single building with 4 apartments, located in a village called Lee Suk near Pyongyang, probably to more easily monitor them. Among the 4 of them, 7 children were born between 1980 and 1986. Just before they moved in, though, Larry Abshir unexpectedly died from a heart attack. He was only 40 years old. Abshir and his wife Anocha from Thailand were the only couple that didn't have any children. Robert later recalled that Abshir's headstone incorrectly indicated he was born in Pyongyang, where it should have read Urbana, Illinois. Anocha for some time remained and lived in one of the apartments alone. She and the Jenkins family each occupied one of the second-floor units. Parrish and his wife, Siham, and Dresnok and his wife, Dona, lived in the 2 bottom-floor units. Abshir's widow, Anocha, was a dear neighbor. She became a sort of aunt or babysitter or caretaker to all of the children in the building. But 5 years after they moved in 1989, the organization took her away. She was being reassigned to marry an East German man. She was never seen or heard from again. But these apartments now were home for these families and remained so for the next 18 years. Jenkins later quipped that being poor in rural North Carolina was a life of luxury compared to living in North Korea. He said the 2 words that would best describe his life in Korea are cold and dirty. Winters in North Korea are harshly cold. The high temperatures in January are usually below freezing. They all shared a single coal furnace, which could barely keep the air above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Often, a cup of water left on a nightstand overnight was frozen solid by morning. Coal rations arrived once per year in September. Trying to conserve coal was difficult, especially because leaders often freely stole from them, and it had to be shoveled into the furnace constantly. During winter in North Korea, everyone is always caked in black soot. The apartments were connected to electricity, but it only worked about 25% of the time. In the Jenkins home, they most often used candles for light and a 12-volt battery to watch TV. Although one day each year, electricity was on all day. It was April 15th, Kim Il-sung's birthday. Unlike his previous houses, the apartments did have indoor toilets, but they still didn't have running water. So they used buckets to flush the toilets, and sewage pipes emptied waste onto the open ground of a nearby hill. The open pipes caused an incessant stench, both inside and outside the building. The pipes also acted as a thoroughfare for rats. The worst smells arose when a rat died somewhere inside the pipes. Several times, Robert recalled he had to disassemble the pipes and sift through the sewage in order to find and remove dead rats. Water for drinking and for cooking came from a well that was about 100 yards from the building. For Mika and Brenda, every single day included hauling buckets of water upstairs. Before it could be used, water had to be boiled. They used either propane tanks or wood fires for boiling water and for cooking. Unlike the other apartments, Robert's had a bathtub. He bought it from a man for 355 packs of cigarettes. It was generally, though, way too much work to use it. Mostly, they bathed at their local public bath, which they were allowed to visit once per week. Food rations were unreliable, often spoiled, and always had bugs in them. Much of their best food came from Robert and Hitomi's own vegetable garden. Robert later recalled that he and Hitomi ate corn noodles for lunch every day for over 15 years. In the 1990s, North Korea descended into a great famine. Soviet food aid had just ended when also they were deluged with rain and floods. North Koreans refer to this tragedy as their arduous march. In fact, it's illegal for them to say words like hunger and famine. Between 1994 and 1999, over 500,000 North Koreans starved to death, and some estimates are even into the millions. Malnourishment has left North Koreans, on average, 5 inches shorter than South Koreans. The Jenkins family lived better than average in North Korea. Robert's daughters were luckily never in peril of actual starvation, but there were occasions that they went 2 full days with nothing to eat. Hunger also caused crime to increase drastically. When vegetables in their garden were nearly ready to pick, Robert would spend whole nights awake and outside to guard his garden. During this time, North Korea's government could not adequately produce and distribute food, but they were able to produce and distribute propaganda. North Koreans were starving to death, but at least the people knew that their hunger was entirely caused by evil U.S. imperialism. Robert and Hitomi's 2 girls, Mika and Brenda, along with Parrish and Dresnock's children, attended school at a farming collective near their apartments. The curriculum was based on 2 main principles. First, that the Kim family is worthy of worship, and second, that the United States is evil. Robert often tried to offset the indoctrination at home, telling his daughters that North Korea is not the real world. Convincing them was more difficult than he hoped. It didn't cause strife or discord at home. Mainly, the girls would just laugh it off as if Dad was being nostalgic or naive. The propaganda was just too ubiquitous. But to Robert's contentment, there were no indications that his girls were treated poorly or differently because they were half American. In North Korean schools, students must provide all of the supplies. Typically, the list would include things like a chair, gasoline, 2 kilograms of copper, and 2 kilograms of lead. Schools were often targeted by thieves. To combat theft, students were assigned rotating around-the-clock guard duties. Younger students took day shifts, and older students stood guard at night. As the children grew into adolescence, one day, a cadre visited their apartment building. And he told them that all of the children had been selected for an elite secondary education. It was purported as a great honor that Kim Jong-il himself, who took control when his father, Kim Il-sung, died in 1994, had personally selected the children. Soon, they were all going to begin studying in Pyongyang at the esteemed foreign language college. Robert and Hitomi feared this was going to happen and knew that the foreign language college meant international spy training. The children's placement at the school was actually a major turning point in a deliberate government scheme decades in the making. By the 1970s, North Korea was almost completely isolated from the rest of the world. North Koreans rarely interacted with foreigners, and foreign marriages were illegal. The organization was quite successful at fostering a nation of people who all looked and behaved like North Koreans. Uniformity was the goal in North Korea, but that also constrained the country's progress in international espionage. Spies can only infiltrate the outside if they can conform abroad. So, North Korea started kidnapping people from around the world. When they arrived in North Korea, they were forced to teach their native language and customs to North Koreans. Almost all of the abductees were brought for this purpose to the Foreign Language College, the same school Mika and Brenda had just been selected to attend. At some point, the organization realized that their espionage program would benefit even more if North Korean agents didn't look so Korean. The 4 American deserters spent the first 6 or 7 years in the country alone. They were never even really given much to do. Then, the organization curiously decided to offer the men citizenship. They emphasized that citizenship would entitle them to their own houses and the opportunity to get married. Shortly after, the organization then started delivering foreign women to them. The North Koreans' fixation on romance or matchmaking wasn't motivated by empathy for loneliness or the kindness of their hearts. Hitomi Soga wasn't violently abducted just to learn English or to provide companionship for a lonely Robert Jenkins. Robert and Hitomi and the others would provide the organization with future spies. They'd have children who lived in North Korea for their entire lives and were educated in North Korean schools. But also, they'd look like they were from anywhere but North Korea. Now, a cadre arrived to take the children to this elite foreign language college to study. Or really, to begin training. They would live at the school. Robert knew it wasn't a choice. Mika and Brenda's future was predetermined. His daughters were going to be North Korean spies. The whole truth about North Korea's abductions remains unknown. There may have been thousands. It's suspected that most of the abductions were from South Korea and Japan, but likely there were also people taken from Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Early on in Japan, the notion that North Korea might be responsible for some unsolved missing persons cases was often dismissed as a confounded conspiracy theory. Only after a seemingly unrelated airplane catastrophe did many in Japan become convinced that the accusations against North Korea were true. Korean Airlines Flight 858, en route from Baghdad to Seoul, crashed into the Indian Ocean on November 29, 1987, killing all 115 people on board. An investigation promptly discovered that a planted bomb caused the crash. And they also discovered that only 2 passengers had deplaned during a previous layover. Those 2 were found and arrested. They were both North Korean, 1 male, 1 female. When these suspects realized they'd be captured, both of them ingested suicide pills. The man died, but the woman was hospitalized and survived. Her name was Kim Hyun-wee. And Hyun-wee had a story to tell. First, she confessed to planting a bomb on the plane. She also revealed her directives to do it had come directly from Kim Jong-il. Kim Hyun-wee was tried in South Korea in 1989. She was convicted and sentenced to death. However, she was later pardoned by South Korean President Roh Tae-woo. He reasoned that because she was a victim of complete brainwashing, she was relieved of culpability. Hyun-hui's exposure to the world outside of North Korea freed her mind, and she eventually unveiled more about her life and her espionage training in North Korea. As a teenager, she'd been selected to attend the elite Pyongyang Foreign Language College. This is, incidentally, the same school that Mika and Brenda Jenkins enrolled in 1995. At the school, Hyun-hui's Japanese classes were taught by a man who, she understood, had been kidnapped from Japan and was now being forced to teach her and others Japanese. And she knew there were several other foreigners teaching at the school who had also been abducted. Hyun-hui's revelations drew Japan's suspicions about the abductions out of the realm of conspiracy theory. In fact, it started a social and political movement in Japan to further investigate and to find those who were being held and to hold North Korea accountable. The movement slowly gained steam. Then, in 2001, a Japanese politician named Junichiro Koizumi ran for prime minister on a pledge to resolve the abduction issue. Koizumi won that election. As for Kim Hyun-hui, she still lives in South Korea today, although her name has been changed. South Korea provides her with special security and protection, more so to protect her from North Korean threats than South Korean. Historically, North Korea hasn't been keen on engaging diplomatically with Japan. Recall, Imperial Japan invaded and occupied all of Korea from 1910 to 1945. If not for Japan, Korea probably never would have been divided at all. But just as Koizumi was elected prime minister in 2001, North Korea was desperate to end the famine and grow their economy. They had therefore shown some interest in normalizing trade with Japan, which, of course, was an economic powerhouse. Japanese diplomats had even been considering providing food aid programs to North Korea. So, with both sides wanting something, in 2002, Prime Minister Koizumi and dear leader Kim Jong-il agreed to meet in Pyongyang. At the meeting, Koizumi indicated Japan was receptive to continuing discussions on trade normalization, and he offered an official apology for Japan's actions in Korea in the early 20th century. In return, Kim Jong-il admitted that in the 1970s and 1980s, North Korea was, in fact, responsible for kidnapping several Japanese citizens. Robert Jenkins and Hitomi Soga weren't aware that Kim Jong-il and Junichiro Koizumi had even scheduled a meeting. But Robert happened to see North Korea's state news report that evening. It didn't mention abductions or kidnappings. It only mentioned that Japan's prime minister was in Pyongyang. But that alone was surprising enough to pique Robert's interest. So he found an old contraband radio that belonged to Dresnok's wife, Donna. He finally caught a signal. It was from an international American station in South Korea. Listening to the radio, Robert heard the name Koizumi, and then the name Kim Jong-il. Then, to Robert's shock, astonishment, and wonder, the next name the reporters mentioned was Hitomi Soga. He kept listening, and the name was repeated again and again. Hitomi Soga, Hitomi Soga, Hitomi Soga. Robert hollered for Hitomi to come listen, and together they learned what happened. The radio reporters explained Kim Jong-il admitted that North Korea had abducted 13 people from Japan. 5 of the 13 were still alive, and North Korea had provided those 5 names to Koizumi. Hitomi Soga was one of the 5. But the reporters seemed more focused on the name Hitomi Soga than any of the others. Robert and his wife continued listening. Hitomi's case was even more compelling than the other four for two reasons. First, they reported, Hitomi was married to an American. They knew about Robert, too. And second, apparently nobody in Japan expected Hitomi Soga to be on the list of abductees. There were many lists with hundreds of names. The name of almost every missing person from Japan for the previous 40 years was on a list somewhere, except for Hitomi Soga. The first list Hitomi's name was on was Kim Jong-il's list. After Hitomi and her mother went missing 24 years earlier in 1978, local Japanese authorities, as they normally would, began an investigation. The Soga's house on Sado Island was on the west side of the Japanese mainland. It was so far from Korea. No one there even considered North Korea might have been responsible. On Soga Island, the case quickly went cold. Authorities actually focused their attention on the family. They thought maybe Hitomi's mother had taken her and run away, or maybe even committed a murder-suicide. Mostly, though, the prime suspect was Hitomi's father. He lived nearly a lifetime under suspicion, in addition to tragically losing his wife and daughter. Hitomi's father was alive in 2002. He, too, had finally learned of his daughter's fate, and he experienced the vindication of his complete exoneration. Strangely, North Korea denied any knowledge of or responsibility for the disappearance of Hitomi's mother. Miyoshi Soga's fate remains a mystery to this day. Nobody was as shocked by all of this, though, as Robert and Hitomi. They could not believe their ears. They had no idea what all of this meant for them. Robert later said that, at that moment, he didn't know if his shock was more hopeful or fearful. The day after they heard the radio report, a group of cadres approached the Jenkins home. Robert and Hitomi had heard the report on a contraband radio, so they had to act like they had no idea why they'd come. The cadres said they were there presenting awards for good citizenship. Robert and Hitomi were told they were being rewarded with health exams, a shopping spree, and soon a new house. The couple reacted with feigned gratefulness and ignorance. 4 days later, Mika and Brenda were collected from the foreign language college, and together, all four moved into a large new house in Pyongyang. The day after their move, Hitomi was told that she was needed alone for a meeting. Officials drove her to a nearby government building and then escorted her to a large room. Inside, several important-looking Japanese men approached her. They told her they believed she was Hitomi Soga from Sado Island. They requested her permission to test her DNA. Hitomi agreed to the test. Shortly after, they told her the test had confirmed her identity and added that her father and sister in Japan were hopeful to see her again. Hitomi was speechless. At this meeting, there was no mention of Hitomi's mother, or of Robert, or of leaving North Korea, and Hitomi had been too anxious to ask questions. After she was returned to the new house, she informed Robert that they didn't have to pretend not to know anymore, and they told their daughters the whole story. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of activity for the Jenkins family. They were summoned to photo shoots, to go shopping, and invited to an official state dinner. At that dinner, one high-ranking party official gave Hitomi $1,000. She didn't know why. For the previous 20 years, Her family had lived on $100 a month, and she had just been given $1,000. Shortly after, officials came to tell her that she and the 4 other abductees named by Kim Jong-il could fly to Japan for a 2-week visit. It was all happening so fast. Only a couple of days later, she was on a plane. Robert and the girls went along to the airport to see Hitomi off. None of them knew it would be nearly 2 years before they saw her again. North Korea miscalculated how Japan would respond to their admission about the abductions. Kim Jong-il likely thought coming clean would be viewed as a gesture of goodwill or reconciliation. But in Japan, both politicians and the people were more furious than ever before. Rather than responding with appreciation, they demanded more answers and the return of more people to Japan. North Korea was so unhappy with Japan's response that they halted all diplomacy, and negotiations between the countries ended. Hitomi was still in Japan, while Robert, Mika, and Brenda remained in North Korea. Just when Robert thought it was time to plan for his wife's return home, a cadre visited and told him that Hitomi wasn't coming home. Robert was told that diplomacy had ended and his wife was now being held hostage by the Japanese government. Even the skeptical Robert believed that this was true. He knew Hitomi wouldn't leave him and their daughters if she had a choice, and it made sense to him that Japan might want to hold the abductees for diplomatic leverage. Robert wondered, how could one woman be so unlucky to be held captive by 2 different nations in a single lifetime? Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. He became more and more convinced that the Japanese were now the bad guys. Leaders in Pyongyang were actually showing him what appeared to be genuine sympathy, and the organization continued providing him with basically whatever he wanted. Eventually, though, his girls were called back to school. Now Robert was completely alone. He was lost and depressed. His wife was gone, his daughters were gone, and sure, he had access to stuff now more than ever. And for Robert, that included access to alcohol. For the next 18 months, Robert fell into a period of what he called constant drunken depression. Even Dresnok and his wife tried with little success to console him. There was nothing really that they could do, but they did regularly check in on him. They even developed a little joke between themselves about their check-ins. If Dresnok asked his wife, "Did you check in on Jenkins today?" she'd respond, "Yes, he was passed out on his bed." And Dresnok would then respond with relief, "Well, good, he's alive. Yesterday he was passed out on the floor." Robert and Hitomi were able to communicate with written letters, but they only came once every couple of months. Hitomi's letters confirmed everything Robert had been told, that she was being held against her will, and that she wished she could return to her family in North Korea. Robert's sadness, anger, hatred, and alcoholism led him to a complete nervous and physical breakdown in December of 2002. He spent weeks in the hospital. Through all this, over 18 months, what Robert didn't know was that during that time, while he had received 8 letters from Hitomi, she had actually sent him 30 letters. And the 8 letters he did receive had been opened, read, and edited by the organization. Robert didn't know that Hitomi wasn't being held against her will in Japan. She chose to stay in Japan. Robert didn't know that for all those months, his wife was working closely with Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, trying to get the rest of her family out of North Korea. Hitomi, more than anything, wanted her daughters out of the foreign language college. While she was working to make that happen, Robert was drinking himself half to death and seething in anger at the Japanese government. In addition to thinking his wife was being held hostage, the organization was also telling Robert that Japan hoped to turn him over to the US Army so he could be arrested and executed for desertion. Robert was also told that his daughters, if they ever left North Korea, would be treated terribly anywhere. They told him the United States would make sure of it because his girls were North Korean and they were the daughters of an American traitor. It took Hitomi and Prime Minister Koizumi nearly a year just to arrange another meeting, but the parties finally agreed to meet on May 22nd, 2003, in Pyongyang. This time, the meeting would be private. Only Prime Minister Koizumi, Robert, Mika, and Brenda would attend. Apparently, the organization was confident Robert wasn't interested in leaving North Korea, and the North Koreans insisted the meeting had to take place in Pyongyang. That meant Hitomi could not be there. It was too dangerous for Hitomi to return to North Korea. Koizumi wanted to meet with Robert. He was hopeful to get him and his daughters out of North Korea. And Robert wanted to meet Koizumi too. He wanted to demand the return of his wife. Koizumi needed Robert to want to leave North Korea. He had to convince him that Hitomi wasn't a hostage and that the United States was not going to execute him. Koizumi was able to alleviate Robert's fears to some degree, but not completely. He could tell that Robert was confused and he wasn't going to agree to leave North Korea. So Koizumi developed a new strategy. He asked if Robert would be willing to meet with him again in what he termed a neutral country. It would be a country without an extradition treaty with the United States, so Robert couldn't be arrested and executed, and Hitomi would be able then to join them to prove that she wasn't a hostage. Robert agreed. North Korea agreed for the meeting to go forward too because, for the organization, Robert's continued insistence on staying in North Korea was turning into propaganda gold for them. It took Koizumi another 2 months to organize everything, and on July 8th, 2003, delegations from Japan, including Koizumi and Hitomi, and from North Korea, including Robert, Mika, and Brenda, met in a hotel conference room in Jakarta, Indonesia. In the 2 months prior to the Jakarta meeting, Robert's head cleared enough for his perspective and his goals to change. He decided he wasn't going to worry so much about himself. Instead, he would focus on Hitomi and his daughters. He needed to reunite his girls with their mother. He didn't care if it was in Japan or North Korea or on the moon. And he accepted that for it, he might end up in prison. After their plane landed in Indonesia, Robert and his daughters exited down a small flight of steps. Hitomi quickly grabbed him for a hug and a kiss. Robert then took his first steps on soil outside of North Korea in 38 years. Robert, Mika, and Brenda were all astonished by the sights and sounds of Jakarta and their hotel. There were so many cars, the TV was huge, and programming aired 24 hours a day. Their hotel room was larger and more comfortable than their apartment in Lee Suk. Before any official business began, Hitomi cleared everything up for Robert. She was not being held hostage by Japan. She chose to stay in Japan. She wanted him and Mika and Brenda to leave North Korea too. And with that, the decision became even easier. North Korean officials expected Robert to travel to Jakarta and publicly announce to the world that he would never leave their little utopia. But that wasn't going to happen now. The couple, Robert and Hitomi, immediately announced to the Japanese delegation the Jenkins family wanted to live in Japan. It was a joyous reunion indeed, but Hitomi could also sense that Robert's mind was still preoccupied with anxiety. He knew that a move to Japan made his arrest inevitable. Hitomi could only tell him that he shouldn't be too worried about it. Robert wondered how she could say that. In the United States, convicted deserters can receive the death penalty or life in prison. But Robert sensed a striking change in Hitomi's entire disposition. In North Korea, she was shy and timid. Now, she was confident and smart. She was powerful. Outside of North Korea, the couple's power dynamic reversed, and Robert felt compelled to trust her. Hitomi's power was based on knowledge. She had information, which meant she had answers to questions. Whether by mob or dictatorship, censorship robs the people of their power. It induces otherwise smart, capable, and good people, like Hitomi Soga, to be demure and spiritless. The North Korean government knows this. Imposing an ideology by suppressing alternatives doesn't win people's hearts, and it doesn't create collective virtue. Such virtue is much more often achieved when smart, capable, and good people like Hitomi are allowed to be smart, capable, and good. Hitomi had been out of North Korea for the previous 18 months. In that short time, she had acquired the confidence and found the tools she needed to become a leader. And now Robert, agreeably, followed her lead. It seemed the entire country of Japan celebrated the news that Hitomi was bringing her husband and daughters home. The Jenkins family spent 12 days in Indonesia while all of the paperwork and legalities were being settled. One night, while dining in the hotel's restaurant, Robert was told that he had a phone call. He was nervous to take the call. He thought, was it North Korea calling to threaten him? He walked to the phone, picked it up, and said, "Hello?" From the other end, he heard a woman's voice respond. "What's up, Bubba?" Robert couldn't respond. He began to sob. It was his sister, Pat, calling from North Carolina. It was the first time that he'd heard a voice from his old family in 40 years. Robert collected himself and he spoke to Pat for about 20 minutes. He learned 2 of his sisters had died, but his other 5 siblings and his mother, Patty, 91 years old, was still alive. His mother's health was deteriorating quickly. Robert ended the conversation with his sister Pat by saying, "Please tell Mama to hold on. I'll be home soon." The Jenkins family flew to Tokyo on July 18th, 2003. The first contact the U.S. Army made to Robert didn't exactly set a date for his execution. It was a letter informing him that a lawyer was being appointed to represent him free of charge. Robert couldn't believe it. Attorney James Culp would help Robert through his criminal case. Robert told Attorney Culp he wanted to admit to his crime and he hoped that he could make peace with the U.S. Army. Robert didn't know that military deserters are not discharged, which meant he was still legally on active duty. Culp suggested to Robert that his best option for initiating peace with the United States Army would be to report for duty. So on September 11th, 2003, 63-year-old Robert Jenkins walked to Camp Zama, the closest American Army base in Japan. The gate at Camp Zama was manned by Lieutenant Paul Nigara. Robert approached Lieutenant Nigara, saluted, and said, "Sir, I am Sergeant Robert Jenkins. and I am reporting for duty. With that, Robert Jenkins became the longest missing deserter in American history to return to the U.S. Army. He was assigned to work at Camp Zama as a clerk. Several other clerks had to teach him how to use the computer. After 6 weeks, he was dishonorably discharged. To his astonished surprise, everyone in the Army treated him kindly. During those weeks, Robert and Attorney Culp prepared for his court-martial. The Army charged him with desertion and aiding the enemy. Robert pled guilty. The prosecution accepted his plea, and he was sentenced to 30 days in jail. Robert was offered clemency for several reasons. He was culpable for desertion, but it was generally believed that entering and living in North Korea wasn't done with malicious intent. Also, he sat for several interviews with U.S. intelligence officers and provided all the information he could from his unique perspective about North Korea. Robert served 25 days at Yokosuka Naval Base Jail. He was released 5 days early for good behavior. His duty had ended. His sentence was served. Everything was done. After being released, Robert traveled to Sado Island, Hitomi's childhood home. And Robert, Hitomi, Mika, and Brenda were ready to begin their new lives together in Japan. Robert Jenkins was the only North Korean deserter to eventually leave the country. Larry Abshir died in 1983 at the age of 40. His wife, Anocha, from Thailand, was assigned to remarry in 1989, and none of the Americans ever saw her again. Anocha's family did not know where she was until Robert published a picture in which she could be seen in the background. Her family in Thailand still hopes for her eventual return home someday. Jerry Parrish died in 1998 at the age of 54. His wife, Siham from Lebanon, and his 3 children still live in North Korea. James Dresnok died in 2016 at the age of 74. His first wife, Dona from Romania, died in 1997. Dresnok remarried, and his second wife and 3 children still live in North Korea. At least one of Dresnok's sons is a graduate of the Pyongyang Foreign Language College. Robert arrived in Japan and met Hitomi's father just before he passed away. Her father extended his blessings upon their marriage, which meant a great deal to Robert. The Jenkins weren't able to visit North Carolina immediately. The U.S. State Department denied Robert's request for a passport. It took 6 more months and several State Department interviews, but eventually the decision was reversed. All 4 of the Jenkins family flew to North Carolina on June 14, 2005. Robert saw siblings and friends and met many nieces and nephews for the first time. His now 93-year-old mother, Patty, was stricken with Alzheimer's, but alive. She wasn't quite able to grasp the meaning of his return, but Robert was so happy he arrived in time to see her once more. Much had changed in Robert's old home over 40 years. He didn't know until he arrived in North Carolina that racial segregation was now illegal in the United States. His daughters were struck with disbelief when they all visited a North Carolina Walmart. The Jenkins trip to America was reported on all over the world. They were especially followed everywhere by hordes of Japanese press. Hitomi especially was, and still is, a sensation, really a national hero in Japan. At that time, many considered her to be the most famous person in the entire country. Robert knew that in the United States, some people really despised him. He read it, he heard it, and he saw it himself. He was called names like traitor and communist. Many Americans thought his 30-day sentence was too lenient. Robert understands why some people view him unfavorably. He also understands that his unique life has brought him notoriety, and therefore he's become a whipping boy for people who maybe really just despise the act of desertion itself. Many don't realize how common military desertion is. There were over 500,000 desertions surrounding Vietnam, and even more recently, the US military sees anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 each year. Additionally, it's rare for the military to pursue criminal charges against deserters. Usually, only deserters who turn themselves in ever face a court martial, and almost all sentences are 6 months or less. But no matter how common, Robert Jenkins recognizes his decision to desert was wrong and he deeply regrets doing it, especially when he thinks about the men he left behind at Camp Clinch, who, incidentally, Robert learned much later, were never deployed to Vietnam. Overall, though, Robert can't say that he regrets his life in North Korea. Without his life there, he wouldn't have Hitomi, Mika, and Brenda. In total, North Korea admitted to 13 abductions from Japan. Kim Jong-il, however, claimed that he had no personal knowledge of the acts until after they occurred. Japan says that they have confirmed 17 abductions, but almost all estimates are much higher, some of them even reaching into the thousands. North Korea never admitted to abducting people from any other country except for Japan. Maybe that's because Japan is the only country in the world that engaged in any real effort to seek justice and to force the admissions. There aren't any Americans thought to have been kidnapped, and the US has never really shown any public reaction. Many Americans don't even know about the abductions. Although the 1977 kidnapping of a 13-year-old girl named Megumi Yokota received mention in an address to the United Nations by US President Donald Trump in 2017. Trump later also met with Megumi's mother and has remained in touch with her even after his presidency ended. After a month in North Carolina, the Jenkins family returned to their new home on Sado Island in Japan. Robert spent the following years working 5 days a week as a stalker in a cookie factory. He also worked weekends as a groundskeeper at an island tourist attraction called the Sado Gold Mine. Both Robert and Hitomi were often treated like stars in Japan. Most of Robert's work days were at one point or another interrupted by strangers seeking handshakes and photographs. In fact, Robert was so popular at the cookie factory that the company began selling cookies with his name on the boxes. Hitomi also worked full-time at City Hall for their municipality. For fun, Robert and Hitomi tended their garden, raised rabbits, fished, and sometimes visited the local karaoke bar. Robert always sang Elvis songs. Robert's greatest joy was riding his motorcycle around the island. For him, it was always gratifying to simply go anywhere, anytime he wanted. For both Robert and Hitomi, the top priority for the rest of their lives was providing anything they could for their daughter's future. As of 2022, both Mika and Brenda are in their 40s. Mika pursued a career as a teacher, and Brenda as a wedding and event planner. Hitomi Soga is 62 years old, alive and well, still living on Sado Island. She continues to actively pursue information about her mother, still hoping that she might see her again one day. Charles Robert Jenkins, the poor kid from Rich Square, the teenage troublemaker, the 15-year-old National Guardsman, the Army sergeant, the deserter, the college professor, the movie star, the 63-year-old Army clerk, the American, the North Korean, the Japanese man, the husband, and the father, died at his home on Sado Island on December 11th, 2017. He was 77 years old.